Right now, there's a lot of focus on the Mexican drug cartels, especially here in the United States. And with this new administration targeting them directly, you should expect there to be disruption when it comes to their operations, which, in my opinion, would mean there's a good chance they might start moving around the country. And if they're in your area, wouldn't you like to know? And that's exactly what my question was when I reached out to a law enforcement associate of mine. How would I know if the cartel was operating in my community? Of course, I want to avoid any interaction with cartel members if possible, because things can get very violent and dangerous very quickly. But if they're in your community, it's also an important thing for you to know. And luckily, they provided me with some very good information regarding this exact concept. So let's talk about how you can identify if the Mexican drug cartels are operating in your town. And at the same time, I'm going to give you some advice about how to avoid them, because once you interact with the cartels, you are now in a database of potential targets for the future. And luckily, this law enforcement associate of mine, who I greatly appreciate, gave me some tips on how to avoid that. So I actually have some notes here that I want to reference. And yes, I do have my crime gun out here today because we're talking about criminal organizations. It only made sense. So let's talk about signals that the cartels are operating in your area. The reason this all started, just to give you some context, is that I was driving down the highway the other day and drove down a burnt out vehicle, which is usually a vehicle that's abandoned after being stolen or used to commit a crime, and then they light it on fire to get rid of any evidence of whoever was using it. And that's not something you see a lot of out here in the middle of North Dakota. So upon seeing that vehicle, I thought to myself, okay, well, that's kind of a weird indication of crime. I wonder if this means anything else. So I asked this exact question: what about burnt out cars as being a possible red flag? And what I was told is that that's just a signal of low level activity, and it has high visibility associated with it. So what that means is that we're seeing crimes that aren't being hidden from the public anymore, and it's basically an early indicator of criminal establishment in your area, because the way a lot of these organizations operate is with impunity. So they're not too concerned about hiding things, and once things start becoming much more visible, especially in the public eye, that would be a red flag and a signal for you that the cartels may be in your area. Now, another indicator is there is a lot of pass-through vehicle traffic. And what that would mean is that there's vehicles that are out of place or at the wrong times of day, right? If there's vehicles suddenly driving in weird backcountry roads where there's usually not traffic, or at 3 o'clock in the morning when there's usually nobody on the road, that would be an indicator. But especially if these vehicles have out-of-state plates or are rental cars, because that is very common in the sense of being used by the drug cartels to traffic or just commit crimes in general. One of the biggest indicators with these pass-through vehicles is their adherence to traffic laws. In fact, perfect adherence. So they're going the exact speed limit. They're using their turn signals. Everything's working properly. Headlights, taillights, brake lights. It's all within adherence of traffic law because they do not want to be pulled over no matter what. And the police actually look for this specifically because generally people either are going to make some mistakes or they're going to push things a little bit, like 5 miles per hour over the speed limit, right? Or whatever it might be, a rolling stop at a stop sign where nobody else is at ever, right? But in these situations, they're going to comply with all of the rules to the T. So those are things you can look out for in the sense of vehicles. Now, another thing that you would want to be on the lookout for, especially in your community or in your neighborhood in general, would be for stash houses or safe houses. Now, these are usually going to be in rural environments, but they could happen in the suburbs, so it's still worth paying attention to. But in rural environments, there's less probability of interaction with law enforcement or neighbors or anything else along those lines, right? Now, what would give away somewhere being either a stash or a safe house being used by the cartels? Well, first off, would be multiple vehicles of different types in a newly occupied residence. So if there's been a house that was recently rented on your block, or maybe a house that was recently purchased in your area if you live in a rural environment, and there's lots of different cars there all the time right after it was recently rented out or purchased, that would be an indicator. And the limited occupation time with a short burst of activity would also indicate cartel activity. A lot of people come in all at once, they do their dealings, they have their business transactions, and then they all leave and never return. That's something you would want to watch out for. Now, another thing you want to keep your eye out for is houses for rent in your neighborhood. and how they're being used, especially if they're not occupied. So if there's an empty house or a vacant house and there's traffic there, obviously that's something to concern yourself with in the sense of things happening. But there are some things I want to talk to you about here regarding your purpose here and regarding how much you would want to be involved with this, because there are a lot of safety factors that you have to put into this equation before doing anything as some sort of, civilian detective. So we'll talk about that here soon, but I just wanted to make you aware of that. This is not telling you should go surveil these places or get involved, but if you're aware of your environment and you see these things and notice these things happening, now you have some indicators as to there being increased activity. Now, additional criminal indicators that can tell you about cartel activity suddenly spawning in your area would include things like an increase of non-English speaking military-aged males that are new to the area that coincides with a spike in property crimes, especially vehicle break-ins, right? So this would be an indicator because these are the groups that the cartels identify and target directly for recruitment. And so they will then organize these people, and then they will also persuade them to do things that they may not have chosen to do on their own. And that's why that's an indicator, because it gives them a target to start working with in the sense of a criminal element, and then they shape that element to their design. Now, another criminal indicator would be an increase in the organization of crime. So that would refer to the uniform tactics being used, right? So if somebody's breaking into vehicles and they always use the same exact methods, that would be an indicator there in the sense of organizing the crimes themselves. Not to mention techniques that indicate direction from the cartels because they're advanced or they require a level of skill that the average street criminal might not possess. So these are all things to be on the lookout for if you're concerned about the possibility of them being in your area. Now, those are all the red flag alarm bell indicators that you'd want to watch out for that should at least set something off in your mind to say, okay, I think there's something weird going on here. Now, the biggest thing is that you don't want to get involved. You need to avoid the narcotics trade completely to avoid cartel interaction. Now, here's the thing. You might not be involved in the narcotics trade. You might not be a drug user, but you might know someone who is, or you might be related to somebody who is. And when it comes to the cartels, you're guilty by association. If you're involved by proxy, you're potentially collateral to them. And so that's something you definitely need to be aware of. If you have someone who's known to be a drug addict or a user or somebody who's involved in illicit trade activities, like within your family unit or within your friend circle, those people are going to create a dangerous environment for you. And so those are things you want to look out for, especially if you start seeing some of these indications of cartel activity around you. Now, another thing that you should avoid is ransom in the future or who knows what else. So these are all considerations to make, but avoid those things, especially if you have all the previous indicators showing up in your area. Avoid these local marketplaces online where anyone can sell anything, because there's a good chance you might be buying stolen property and you just transacted with somebody who might be affiliated with the cartels. And don't forget, they're now considered foreign terrorist organizations and you just gave them money. And I wonder how that would look in an investigation when it comes to material support. Now, another thing is to never loan out your vehicle. This is a very common tactic used by the cartels to move product or money around, right? So it'll be somebody you know, maybe a coworker, maybe a relative, like a cousin or something, and they'll say, hey, can I borrow your car tonight? I just need to move some stuff from my house and my car's broken down. And most people that are trying to be nice people and have goodwill are gonna be like, oh yeah, I guess so, right? Or something along those lines, especially if they're a relative. Just don't do it. It's not worth the risk, especially if you have those other criminal indicators showing up in your area, because they're going to use your vehicle, or there's a chance they'll use your vehicle for some sort of crime, and now your vehicle is implicated in that crime. And that could cause you some real problems as well, not to mention if something happens with you investigating the loss of your vehicle or investigating where your vehicle was and what it was used for, now you're going against the cartels directly, unnecessarily, all because you let somebody borrow your vehicle. Now, this kind of goes back to the idea of stash houses and safe houses and pass-through traffic and just being aware of things happening in your neighborhood or in your area and then wondering what to do about it. And this is the tricky part, because you don't want to be a citizen detective sitting out front of a cartel stash house recording video and trying to implicate them in crimes and then expect that to go well for you, right? These are dangerous people and they don't use usual tactics. They're definitely willing to put you in harm's way in a very egregious manner. So you don't want to instigate these people. You don't want to be involved with them at all. So what should you do, right? Well, first off, you got to mind your own business. Don't poke around at cartel activity personally. Like, it's just a bad idea. Don't do that. That's not what I'm suggesting in this video at all. I'm letting you know what to watch out for, and then I'm telling you how to avoid unnecessary interactions, and poking around would definitely be an unnecessary interaction. But this is also, and I know this is going to get some people probably claiming I'm a Fed again, or upsetting some people when it comes to the police. But I don't care, because this is for your information and you should do what you will with it. But regardless, it's another reason to have a relationship with a police officer. Not necessarily with the police, but if you are involved in your local community, you should probably know at least one police officer by name. You don't have to be their best friend. They don't have to come to your wedding. But at least knowing them by name, probably not the worst idea, right? In order to establish a little bit of communication and a little bit of a network. And then what you're going to do is you're going to ask that network to look into some of these things that you're noticing that they might not have time for or resources for otherwise. And so that's one of the main reasons why having a relationship with at least a police officer in your area is a good idea. If they're in your jurisdiction, right, and that's where they're legally allowed to operate, maybe not the worst thing to tell them about, hey, that stash house down the street, or what I think might be one, is something you probably want to take a look at some point. And now you've at least done your part without implicating yourself with cartel-related activity, okay? Now, in that same vein, if you do have a relationship with the police, or you have a relationship with a police officer, don't ask them for favors, ever. And I didn't know this, but this is why I'm sharing this with you, because I think it's good information, okay? Don't ask the police for small favors, because for them it's a giant red flag that you might be trying to figure out if they are someone that could be compromised. Because this is what the cartels do. They will find police officers in any organization they can that they can compromise and then use to their advantage. And they're never going to put them in egregious scenarios that forces them to be found out or forces them to be fired, because they're more valuable inside than they are on the outside. So it's not going to be obvious when somebody's corrupted or compromised, but it is something that they attempt to do regularly. So if you're talking to good police who want to avoid this type of stuff, especially in their department, you might ask them, hey man, by the way, could you help me out with that ticket, right? And immediately that's going to raise a red flag of, I might want to look into this guy a little bit. Why is he trying to compromise me? Why is he trying to get me to do something that wouldn't be ethical, right? And then that's one of the ways that you could find yourself being looked at as untrustworthy if you ever need to report some of these other signals. So this is all information I got directly from a law enforcement officer who's very well versed in this type of behavior, in the sense of what the Mexican drug cartels are doing around the country. And I wanted to share it with you all because I find them to be the most likely adversary that we would actually have to defend ourselves from at the civilian level, because they operate in our communities. They operate in our towns, and our police forces, especially in the rural environment, are usually not equipped well enough to actually deal with that threat on their own. So hopefully this gave you some things to think about. All I'm trying to do here is give you considerations and advice that I wanted for myself and that I actually received. And then I thought I would do my duty, I guess we'll call it, of passing it along to you and hopefully help out other Americans with what could possibly be a crisis here very soon. If you need anything else from me, go to magicprepper.com. There's a lot of resources there, and it's always a good place to check out. And besides that, that's going to be it for Magic Prepper.